All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I love that. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we had a beautiful day outside, and so there isn't a better way to finish out our day today than here talking about a really excellent book. Um, is anyone here at the People's Forum for the first time? Oh, okay. Yes. Well, welcome. We love to see it. This might be familiar for those who have been here before, but the People's Forum is a community center, a political education center, a art space. It's all dedicated to uplifting the working class struggle and our fight for liberation. We have a lot of different offerings. One is courses, for example. We just wrapped up our course, Our Freedom Can't Wait, which is on the Black liberation struggle in the United States. And we have a course coming up called Understanding Zionism that's in collaboration with the Palestinian Youth Movement, so you should all definitely check that out. We also have movie screenings every Thursday. Every Monday, we do volunteer meetings for the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, where hundreds of people come out across the city to do outreach and organize events for Palestinian solidarity. So just to say, there's a lot to take advantage of here, and we should definitely see you again if you haven't been here before. And thanks to everyone who's coming back again. And so, as a space that's committed to deepening and strengthening our understanding of all facets of our fight for liberation, it only follows that we are extremely excited to uplift and celebrate tonight's book, Disability and Empire, Class, U.S. Imperialism, and the Struggle for Disability Justice, which is published by 1804 Books. This volume, if you saw it at the front, it's a pretty slim volume, but that's because it's a very efficient and effective intervention into why the struggle for disability is crucial to the fight for liberation for all. Today, we'll be walking through some of the key facets of the disability struggle that this book covers, which is a lot. It's from the social construction of disability in the US to the role of US imperialism in disabling millions of people through their wars, to how socialist countries address disability. But before I give too much away, I want to underscore that at the heart of this book is the theme of struggle, of fighting for the world that we want to see, because, it's in the title, actually, after all. Because it's unavoidable when talking about disability justice. We can't talk about its history without talking about solidarity with the Black liberation struggle. We can't talk about it without talking about students and young people fighting for disabled people. And we can't talk about it without talking about Palestine, of course. We can see it in the news. The UN last year called Gaza home to the largest number of amputee children in history. So it's impossible to talk about disability justice without acknowledging class, US imperialism, and of course, the fight that follows, because we won't take it lying down. Yeah. So to ground us in this, I'm actually going to open us up with a short clip from a movie called Crip Camp. It was a documentary that was made in 2020 about a revolutionary summer camp for teens with disabilities. And those teens were actually so inspired that they eventually grew up to lead the 504 protests. And I'm just curious, has anyone heard of those protests before? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So for those who don't know, it was a series of protests that happened across the country to protest how the government was not implementing Section 504, which called for no discrimination for federal assistance for people with disabilities. And so people took to the streets across the country, but very notably in San Francisco, people occupied a federal building for 25 days, which is the longest occupation of a federal building in history. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen easily. They cut off food and water in an attempt to shut them out. But solidarity from organizations across sectors, from the Black Panthers to United Farm Workers, helped bring supplies in. And when a delegation went to Washington to meet with officials, they had no access, but the Teamsters, the International Association of Teamsters, helped them get there. And it also highlights the creativity of our movement and the creativity of our people, because when they cut phone lines, and there were no cell phones at this point, people used sign language to communicate with people on the outside about what supplies they needed and other communications. So it just highlights how we all have stuff to bring to the table when it comes to fighting for liberation. So I guess we'll play the clip right now. Thanks, Ryan. Oh, I forgot to mention, on the April 5th was actually the 48th anniversary of this event. And so this is the beginning of it.
Brad Lomax was the one who had the idea to call the Black Panthers. Brad could hardly speak, but he could gesture. And he got his point across.
The Panthers would bring a hot meal for dinner, and then they would leave food for breakfast and lunch. For nothing, no money, no nothing. I ended up, after the meeting, I said to this guy, I said, I don't get it. You're the Black Panther Party and you don't have a ton of resources. They had a food kitchen in Oakland. Why are you choosing to feed us? He said to me, you are trying to make the world a better place, and that's what we are about. We are about making the world a better place for everybody. So if you're going to go to the trouble to stay here and sleep on this floor, we're going to make sure you get fed. That's how we survived.
We have a cafeteria, we have a conference room, we have beds all over the place, mattresses, food. It's incredible.
Our support was much broader than just within the disability community. Union members and other civil rights organizations, we had relationships with local government. The mayor was clearly in support. One of the secretaries in Sacramento sent down mattresses. Clyde Memorial Church, which was run by a progressive minister.
We are a people who believe in liberation.
It was the right place, the right time.
One of the women who ran the big lesbian bar in the East Bay came and said, what do you guys need? And we said, oh, we're so tired of being dirty. And so her partner was a nurse, and they went out and bought like a gallon of shampoo and a gallon of cream rinse. And one night just showed up, and for 3 hours, anybody that wanted their hair washed got their hair washed.
Oh, good morning, sister.
You can't imagine what the 504 sit-in was like. It was camp. Everything we learned at Crip camp was what we did there.
Wasn't that beautiful? I think we're all learning a lot about what it means to be in solidarity. It isn't something that we do out of empathy or sympathy. We do it because we are all oppressed by the same system. We can all feel the effects of what it means to be exploited, by capitalism, by our bosses, by US imperialism. And so it's necessary that we all stand by side and fight. And that's also why it's such a beautiful thing to be joined by 3 people who have been fighting for decades for a better world, the authors of tonight's book. I'm going to take some time to introduce them, but these bios are just a brief glimpse into all of the accomplishments and all of the contributions that they've made to the struggle. But first, we're joined by Joyce Chediak. She has participated in activism going back to the civil rights. She's participated in activism going back to the civil rights, women's, and anti-Vietnam War movements of the 1960s. An Arab American, she has written on the Middle East and women's issues for over 5 decades. She's a registered nurse, just like my mom, and the former assistant editor of the American Journal of Public Health. Chediak is hard of hearing and dyslexic, and is currently a national editor of the Liberation News website. Give it up for Joyce. Oh, slow down, sorry. Jane Cutter is a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She is a lifelong caregiver, starting as a teen, providing care to family members and neighbors with disabilities, and has taught students with disabilities and earned a doctorate in special education. Some of her earliest experiences as an activist include participating in protests at the Saks Theater chain in Boston with the Disabled People's Liberation Front. Give it up for Jane. And then finally, we are joined by Sunil Freeman, who was the Party for Socialism and Liberation's 2020 vice presidential candidate, running with Gloria La Riva. He has also written for Liberation News, and his essays have been published in journals including The Gargoyle, American Kahani, Delmarva Review, Washingtonian, The International, and Jaggery. His music reviews have also appeared in The Washington Post and in his fiction in The Account. Now retired, he worked for many years as assistant director of the Writer Center, a nonprofit in Maryland. Give it up for Sunil. I also wanted to mention that tonight is in part a tribute to 3 other fighters for disability justice. I'm going to mention their stories in brief, but they're 3 people who you'll learn more about later in the presentations tonight. Oh, 1 second. Awesome. One is Carrie Ann Lucas. She was an internationally known disability rights attorney and a mother to 4 who lost her life after United Healthcare arbitrarily denied her access to crucial antibiotics. Shame. Another is, I skipped. Ingracia Figueroa, who was a woman who fought tirelessly for other people with disabilities, only to have her custom wheelchair broken during travel by United Airlines, which led to more injury and ultimately her passing. Shame. And then finally, one of the authors actually of tonight's book. His name is John Peter Daly, and he, from my understanding, was the person who first thought of this book in its most original form. And he was a beloved organizer and community member to many. So we're honoring all 3 of them tonight. And of course, while I mention their passing, because we all understand how they suffer these senseless, needless deaths under a system that refuses to care for working people everywhere. But again, at the heart of this book and at the heart of their lives was this need to fight for a better world for people everywhere. And their lives were a refusal to let that very system go unchallenged. And so, without further ado, I'll let our amazing authors take it away. I'll be asking a couple of questions, but also I encourage you all to think of your own questions. And so we can learn from their insights and expertise on how we can take up this banner as well as we organize in the streets today. So we'll do presentations, we'll do questions at the end. And I also want to shout out our huge virtual audience who are joining us also and they're with us today. And also I want to thank our amazing interpreters, Jamie Rose and Anaya, who are here tonight doing the hard work of keeping up with my yapping. So I would like to start us off with a question for our speakers tonight. First, can we talk about, why did you write this book? And why did you write this book now? And I think that's a great place to start.
Good time to uplift the struggle for disability justice. It impacts so many members of the working class, and really anyone at any time can find themselves in the category of being disabled. And today more than ever, we see that the billionaire agenda is trying to stand in the way of their ability to make more obscene profits. So, I think another reason we wrote it, the struggles of the past that, like we saw in the video, led to victories. But even back in 2021, when we started writing, we could see that the promise of those wins had not been fully achieved because of the way capitalism structures society, so that the needs of the bosses, the so-called needs, are put over the needs of the people. Now, in 2025, we're seeing that the government is directly putting things like rights and equality for any oppressed group directly in their crosshairs. And we're seeing that enforcement for the rights of people with disabilities is pretty much being eliminated at the federal level. So people like us who are concerned with creating a more just and liberated future, we need to understand how we won these rights in the first place and what it's going to take to achieve full liberation. Like was mentioned by Kate, the initial impetus came from John Peter Daly. And he was a lifelong, maybe we could, we're on that slide. lifelong socialist organizer and a gay man who joined the struggle as a young man in the 1980s. Professionally, he worked in public health for many years with a particular focus on HIV education and prevention. And he became disabled in midlife. And as the organizer that he was, he saw opportunities for struggle and for making new connections. In writing the book, he wanted to focus on the super exploitation of the care workers he now depended on and to build bridges of unity and solidarity. And he really wanted this book to uplift the names of activists like Gracia Figueroa and Carrie Ann Lucas, who Kate also already mentioned, who were literally killed by capitalism. And I'd like to just talk a little bit more about Gracia Figueroa. She was a member of an organization called Hand in Hand, which advocated for domestic workers, including home care attendants. And so in 2019, she traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak at a rally called Care Can't Wait. And on the way home, United Airlines destroyed her custom-built $30,000 wheelchair. Now, that's a pretty typical price tag for a motorized chair. Also, the fact that her chair was destroyed by them is a pretty common occurrence for travelers who use wheelchairs. About 20 wheelchairs or motorized scooters every day are lost, damaged, or stolen when people travel on airlines. So she fought for the company to buy her an equivalent chair, but they resisted for years and insisted that she use an inadequate chair. And eventually they did pay for the chair, but the damage was done. Because of using an incorrect chair, she developed a pressure sore, which the chair that she owned was specifically designed to prevent from happening. And as a result, she ended up in the hospital with complications from an infection, which ultimately is what killed her. But she kept fighting, even from the hospital. She tweeted, linking disabled rights movement to Black Lives Matter and other oppressed groups to build solidarity. After her death, her friend Madeline Race said, I would tell people to continue to fight ableism and understand the importance of disability rights. Wheelchairs are an extension of someone's body, and disabled lives like hers matter.
Thank you, Jane, for highlighting that for us. I also think it's important as we go forward in this discussion to actually define disability and what it means. And I think this book makes an excellent intervention into, complicating perhaps more traditional, more conventional understandings of disability that's given to us. But maybe, Joyce, could you illuminate how disability, as you write in the book, is a social construct? What does that mean, and why is it important?
Okay. Well, I think we have to take a little bit of a look at the Trump administration first. Trump and anti-disability prejudice is at the heart of the new Trump administration. Trump has blamed people with disabilities for a plane crash. This is a demonstration against the use of the R word, retarded, which is not an acceptable word. However, it's a word that Elon Musk uses regularly now and encourages others to use. He uses it to mock ideological enemies. This is a slur rooted in the dehumanization of people with intellectual disabilities and is associated with euthanasia movements in the 1930s. The administration is also claiming that accessibility is responsible for cost of living increases, and it's justified its cutting in half the Civil Rights Division of the Board of Education, which deals with the question of accessibility for students. Alongside diversity, women, words like accessibility and disability are now being used to reject grant applications at the National Science Foundation. Trump sees people with disabilities as defective, incompetent, dangerous, a burden on society, and fair game to be scorned and ridiculed. This is a social construct of disability used to rationalize oppression and justify Trump's cuts. In this book, we take off the private property colored glasses and look from a working class lens at the different ways disability has been defined at different times. The first one may be the most telling. We were told that early humans were brutal to each other, did not value people, that they threw people with disabilities away. I don't know if people remember the stereotype of the caveman with the club, dragging his wife along with her hair with the other hand. Popular belief is that safety, compassion, and care for people with disabilities and others is a product of what they call civilization, or what we might call class society. In 1907, however, archaeologists found the bones of a young man who lived 4,000 years ago in North Vietnam that told a different story. Oh, I should do this. I'm sorry. This is a little out of order. There was evidence that he had been paralyzed from the waist down before adolescence and had very little use of his arms and couldn't feed himself or keep himself clean. Yet this disabled person lived another 10 years. The people in this Neolithic society did not throw him away. They tended to his every need. About 30 similar remains have been found in areas ranging from Europe to Asia to the US to the Middle East. Some go back 45,000 years and show pathology so severe that the affected people must have needed and gotten round-the-clock care. This compassionate care for fellow humans developed when most people lived as equals. Their survival as a group depended on working together and sharing resources. There was tolerance and cooperation. People were valued for their gifts, what they could contribute to society, not what they didn't have. With class society came certain technological advances, that's for sure, but it has not brought compassion. It has brought inequality, stratification, judgment, and great suffering. Fast forward to capitalism. Capitalism sees people with disabilities as having no intrinsic value. It regards accommodations that would enable people with disabilities to work as overhead expenses to be avoided. Capitalists invented what is called the medical model. These are the two models, and this is what the disability movement has defined. The medical model for disabilities points out that people with disabilities can't work full time, their legs might not work, they can't climb stairs, they need medication, they have special needs, that the problem is with the disabled person. The disability justice movement has given us the social model, that physical and environmental barriers, attitudinal barriers, institutional and organizational barriers, information and communication barriers are the problem. The problem is barriers in society. Using the social model, we will explore disability in this book here and abroad, and the US role in perpetuating it. We'll explore how we can secure once and for all the rights that we fought so hard for, so they can never be taken away again, as we see happening now, and how we can get back to the mores of pre-class society where people were valued but they contribute. We will show who people with disabilities are, not helpless people to be pitied, but people like our 504 fighters in Crip camp, bursting with life, love, and humor. Here's a on the lineup of the wheelchairs is the beginning of the ADOPT movement and the accessibility movement in Colorado, where people in chairs chain themselves together and block the buses. And that's how they got access to the buses. The other picture is the Crip crawl, the Capitol crawl. This is how we got the American with Disabilities Act. This is the final straw, and that act is 35 years old this year, where 70 people got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the Capitol because it was the only way they could get up. And people with disabilities are some of our best fighters, not only for their own rights, but for everybody else's rights.
Thank you so much for sharing that important distinction, Joyce. I think it's something that's important for us to uplift, especially as we develop ourselves as fighters, as people who are understanding all of the different ways that this system, this capitalist system, oppresses us, restricts us, makes us unable to live the full lives that we know we can live. And you mentioned that people with disabilities are some of our best fighters. And I think it would be good for us to return back to the movie Crip Camp that we talked about earlier. And Sunil will take us through a couple of the connections between a summer camp for children and the long fight for liberation and what it means to build a world that is that considers all of the different ways people can bring their own abilities and own skills to the fight for liberation.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everybody for joining in person there and in Zoom as well. So Crip Camp, Disability Revolution is really a very powerful, powerful movie documentary, well worth watching and finding, available for free on YouTube. The people who were the stars of Crip Camp were kids who grew up rarely seeing many other people with disabilities. They were used to being stared at with pity, with contempt, even with fear, even with anger for even being out in public. And suddenly they're on buses, joining all together at a Catskill Mountains summer camp in the early 1970s, which was a time of powerful liberation struggles, anti-war protests around the country, sounds familiar, people questioning authority in many different ways. And if you add to the mix a bunch of young so-called hippie camp counselors who honestly didn't know exactly what the hell they were doing, but were willing to learn and go with the flow and learn from the kids themselves. So keep in mind here that just as people with disabilities are people, are human beings, which people sometimes forget, children with disabilities are children. And so this beautiful burst of collective kid energy, all finding themselves learning creatively, what they could do together, was very powerfully transformative. It was for me watching it, and I can only imagine what it was like for those kids in the Catskills. As it turned out, they obviously kept in touch, and as the liberation struggle for disability rights really gained steam, the people who were at that Crip camp were leaders in many, many, many of those struggles, many of those battles in that long struggle, I should say, perhaps. One thing I think is really important to take away from this documentary is that the fight for liberation, it's serious, it's life and death, as we've already discussed here already, but it's also fun. It's joyful to join together with comrades in that struggle. And at the 501 protest, watching it through film so many decades later, their backs were sore, they were tired, they were exhausted, and you also know they were having the time of their lives. I think we need to remember that the people in that protest, when they sign language out I grew up when phones were hooked to the wall, so I'm my age here too. But when they decided to sign out the window to the growing audience, such a moment of liberation, such a FU to the people who would deny them. So I think that's really critically important. Now, what were disability rights people fighting up against? And at this point, if we prepared better, we would be cueing scary horror movie music to come in the background. So imagine being a child with a severe disability, being picked up by a man while cameras are beaming your image to millions of viewers across the country. The man stares into the camera, holding you up, and says, and I quote, "God goofed, and it's up to us to correct his mistake." That man was Jerry Lewis. He used kids as props to elicit pity and donations. From 1966 to 2010, he raised almost $2.5 billion for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we go to the next slide? I'm not very good on that part. That's Mike Irvin, and then briefly Emily. Then the next slide. These were people who were used as props by Jerry Lewis and later joined together to form a group that they called Jerry's Orphans, because he referred to Jerry's kids, these kids he used in the telephones. So they make really important points about the damage that these telephones did in terms of attitudes about the helplessness, the infantilizing of people with disabilities. And I'd like to move now, since we spoke about sign language, to the discussion of the Galudet protests. And we could move to the next slide. Great. So in 1988, the Board of Trustees, the Galudet, was picking a new president. Galudet was formed in 1864 as the only university for deaf and hard of hearing people in the world. At this time of the selection for a new president in 1988, there was widespread support in the community to have a deaf president and to move away from the paternalistic, patronizing, condescending attitude that people who were deaf needed hearing people to guide them through the world and be the administration. As it turned out, the Board of Trustees released the information that they were selecting the one hearing candidate rather than any of the two final candidates who were deaf, was obviously infuriating, really adding insult to injury. And students at Galudet sprang into action. There were 4 leaders who were in their teens at the time who organized students, faculty, staff, alumni, all in a powerful protest movement that in the course of a week led to a selection of, in fact, a deaf president at Galudet, the first deaf president at Galudet. They marched to a board of directors meeting. They marched to the Capitol. At one point in that protest, they got school buses to the entrances of Galudet University. They went on strike. They deflated the tires and closed off the campus. Important to note, we're here at the Justice Center on Florida Avenue. Those protests were basically 1 mile down the road on Florida Avenue at Galudet. So there's very significant local reality here. In the end, the students won entirely their 4 protest demands. Importantly, they were so organized, they had demands. One thing we could learn sometimes in our current protests to actually have a focus and strong demands. They wanted the newly elected president to resign, the hearing president, a deaf person to be selected as president. The board chairperson had to step down. Deaf people must constitute a 51% majority of the board. And importantly, no reprisals against protesting students or employees. Total success for the protest. I would note there's a new documentary called Deaf President Now with a deaf director and strong support from the community that was involved in making this happen. There were efforts to make other films that they felt wouldn't treat the protests as well as this. So well worth seeing. I've not seen it yet, but and I'd like to add one other thing I forgot to say, and that is that Brad Lomax, the Black Panther Party member who took the proposal to bring food to the Section 504 protests in the federal building takeover, was the founder of the Washington, D.C. Black Panther chapter. So more and more local connections. And thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, everybody. One last thing. Sorry. I would never hear the end of it on this. A number of our recent comrades joining our Washington, D.C. PSL branch, their parents were in the thick of it in that protest. So I'm so glad I remembered that, because I would rightfully be called out. Thank you. And thanks to the parents who were in that protest.
Thank you so much, Sunil. I think it's amazing to see how these documentaries are excellent tools for uplifting our struggles and their histories, and bringing it to a broader audience. I know that Crip Camp won a lot of accolades, and I'm excited to see Deaf President now coming up in the future. But I want to also highlight a different facet of our struggle, which often doesn't get highlighted. And so I'm going to turn to Jane, actually, because the book makes a crucial intervention into the solidarity between care workers and people with disabilities, underscoring that all workers are exploited and neglected under capitalism. Jane, could you tell us more about how this chapter emerged and what that solidarity looks like?
Yeah, thank you. Really, the initial idea of the book came from John Peter Daly, and he was just so outraged at the deep poverty that he saw experienced by the workers who were caring for him, as well as his struggle, and it was a daily struggle sometimes, to receive consistent care. And one of the big reasons the care wasn't consistent was because the workers were living in the most dire of poverty. And so I worked closely with him on this chapter. And the last part we wrote was the part which is about his own story, which comes at the very beginning of the chapter, but it was actually one of the last things we worked on. And it was really hard because he didn't want the book to be about him. He really wanted this chapter in particular to be about the workers. But we felt the context was necessary. So I think one of the unique contributions is a dialectical analysis of the care worker-client relationship. And on the surface, we point out that it looks like the interests of the care workers and the clients are opposed. John notes there can be animosity between a caregiver and a client because the client wants more care, more hours, more qualified workers, while the worker wants to avoid being worked to exhaustion while dealing with the fact that they're living in poverty. And the workers he was dealing with in Louisiana were basically making federal minimum wage. He wrote, "As a client, I feel like I'm a set of hours to the workers. But before I became disabled, I was a worker. So I understand this many hours means this many dollars, and that's how much they have. Seeing other people as hours and dollars is not something workers or disabled people came up with ourselves. It is something the system put on us." Something that resolves this contradiction is the fact that caregivers' working conditions are the same as disabled people's living conditions. Fighting for caregivers to have a living wage is part and parcel of struggling for people with disabilities to get quality care that can facilitate independence and the ability to fully participate in society. So going back to a quote from the book, in 2019, John relates how when he first began getting services, he went and he met with his local Department of Health, and he asked them when the care workers would get a raise. And he told them there's no way disabled people can have dignity if our caregivers don't have it. So it's from this solidarity that it's this solidarity that John envisioned and tried to foster every day. And from this flowed an innovative idea or approach for how to organize care workers, which is outlined in the chapter. And so, thinking like a true organizer. What is the case, especially in Louisiana and in other parts, especially in the South, is that the care workers are employed by many different small agencies, and those agencies all have contracts with the state. So a traditional way of organizing would be to organize agency by agency, and try to organize all the workers that way. But there's also a lot of challenges and problems really with that approach, with a minimum, making it less likely that you would actually be successful. So John's idea was to take a leaf from a group called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, who were farm workers picking tomatoes. And instead of organizing and negotiating with each small tomato farm, there was a coalition of workers and community allies who targeted the big companies that purchased the tomatoes. So companies like McDonald's and Wendy's, and they pressured them to pay a higher price per pound for the tomatoes. And if a company wouldn't agree, they pressured, they boycotted, they protested until they did agree to pay the higher price. So John thought this approach could be adapted to build a client worker community alliance to pressure state and federal agencies that fund caregiving services to improve conditions for workers, and thus by extension, improve the care for the clients.
Thank you for sharing that, Jane. It's one of the more unique interventions that this book makes, and all the more reason to read it. And so I'm actually going to turn to Sunil. So while we're talking a lot about domestic struggles, even as we address Trump or as we address Elon, many people focus entirely on US policies, but have little to say about global issues and when it comes to disability. But this book kind of obliterates that separation. Sunil, can you talk a bit about the connections between disability and imperialism?
Yes, thank you. And if we could have the next slide, please. Great. Before discussing the particulars of disability and the military, I can't help but think of how Martin Luther King Jr. was so viciously attacked when he finally spoke out against the war in Vietnam so forcefully on April 4th, 1967, and how politicians never talk about his anti-imperialism when January 15th rolls around every year. That's completely forgotten. Also of note is how the military is somehow exempt when people discuss causes of climate change. So the military is the 8 billion ton elephant in the room on a lot of things. We can see, and I can't actually read them very well, but the Vietnamese struggling with generation after generation of cancers and birth defects, neurological and other disabilities due to Agent Orange. The many Vietnam War veterans who've also died as a result of exposure to Agent Orange. Landmines killing to this day 15 to 20,000 people every year. So it's important to understand also, and here we could go to the next slide as well, that the wars, even after the war is over in Fallujah, we have so many birth defects and military service members with so many disabling injuries. I think it's also important to note there doesn't even have to be a shooting war. At the Red Hill military base in Oahu, Hawaii, there have been tens of thousands of gallons of fuel leaking into a water aquifer that serves not only the military base, but also the surrounding community. And the military has been adamant in not really responding to that threat to so many people in that community. One thing about the military and disability that I think parallels in some ways the work John was doing, that Jane talked about, the connection between care workers and people with disabilities, is the fact that, and we could do the next slide as well, is the fact that the service members have been making connections with those communities where the US military caused so much damage. The organization Veterans for Peace has worked to build solidarity between US veterans and service members and victims of US military aggression all around the world. Their work has included fighting for reparations for victims of Agent Orange, purifying water in Iraq, whose water supplies were so badly damaged as part of the overall devastation in Iraq, and fighting to ban the use of landmines. Now, we can't speak about the US military without discussing Gaza and discussing more broadly Palestine. And we could move to the next slide. We're living in a crazy world. And I think the easiest illustration of it that I can think of is that if you told me 30 years ago, having live streamed a devastating genocide in which children who are severely traumatized are undergoing amputations without anesthetic, and that would be normal, you would say that couldn't happen. That's not doable. But somehow that is happening in Gaza. The devastation has involved the destruction of hospitals around the entire region, the killing of healthcare workers, deliberate killing of healthcare workers, emergency responders, killing of journalists, even before the current genocide in Gaza, when there was the Great March of Return to the separation wall, nonviolent Great March of Return to the separation wall. The Israeli troops made fun and had contests in how many people they could kneecap, how many people they could deliberately disable, aiming specifically for health workers who were marked as health workers. So all of these things, I think, are crucially important in understanding the role that the US military, and when we speak of the US military, we're speaking of the military complex, US military industrial complex, military industrial academic media, and you can add on so many other things into that mess of empire, basically. I think one other thing to keep in mind is the numbers of 50,000 or whatever are so incorrect, because it's more like more than 100,000. Frederick Engels wrote of the concept of social murder, which I think is more and more relevant the longer this empire continues. The deliberate creation of circumstances which will lead to death, which is one aspect of the genocide in Gaza that is taking place. So we protest obviously against what's happening in Palestine, what's happening with the military industrial complex. And I think one really important thing of this book, fact of this book, is that acknowledgement and understanding of the role that the US military plays in creating disability all around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Sunil. Yeah, I think it's extremely illuminating to look at how the US treats people outside of its own borders, because it actually underscores the experiences that we have at home that resonate with those very experiences. How this system has no interest in creating conditions where we can thrive. It only has interest in profiting off of us, of exploiting us to the point of impairment, to the point of death. And so that's why it's our responsibility to take up that fight. And so while we're talking a lot about the history, we're kind of coming up into this present day moment. And I think, Jane, you're going to speak a bit on the present day status of people with disabilities. Could you highlight that for us today?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we not to belabor a point, but right now, the federal civil rights enforcement apparatus about many things, but including disability rights, is being completely gutted under the current administration. But even before Trump took office again, we were very well aware that having rights written in the law on paper is good, but laws don't enforce themselves, right? They need to be enforced to have actual meaning. And if we look at the slide on employment, you can see that since the passage of the ADA, the employment rate of people with disabilities has significantly declined. Even though there's a law that says people should not be discriminated against in employment, why has this gone down? It's because first of all, there's no enforcement. It's hard to enforce. It's hard to prove discrimination in a capitalist system where a job is not a right. So you can see this, that there's many people who would like to work who are not, it's not that they're not able to work, it's that they're not being allowed to work by a discriminatory system. If we look at the next slide about housing, we can see that, it's illegal to discriminate against people with housing, with disabilities in housing. But the reality is there's not enough housing that's even available that's accessible to people with mobility impairments. And there's especially a very small amount of affordable housing is accessible. And that's because in this society, it's housing is a commodity made for profit, not for human needs. And so there's countless people who would be delighted to have an apartment or a home, a house that was accessible, but and that because landlords and developers don't think it's profitable to provide that. Some related statistics. 1/2 of the people who are living in poverty in the United States have a disability, and 1/4 of homeless people also have a disability. Another big concern, and I think it's a concern really for most people, but it's a particular concern to people with disabilities, is the issue of healthcare. And that's based on actual surveys that was identified as a top issue of concern. And it only makes sense, just like housing and employment being governed by the capitalist market. Our healthcare system, if you want to call it a healthcare system, is based on a for-profit model instead of being a right. And one particularly egregious example of how we can see how this profit-based system works is in the diabetes epidemic. 10.5% of the US population has diabetes. And in 2021, 100,000 people died as a result of diabetes. Now, it can be prevented. This disease can be prevented and it can be managed. It doesn't have to be a death sentence. And a lot of what is necessary is what we would consider public health measures. People can be screened, people can be, medical professionals, nurses, public health workers can work with people in the community to help them manage their illness and to take care of themselves so that they can live the best possible life and prevent the disease from getting worse. But in a privatized healthcare system, that's not a really profitable model. Funds for that kind of care is being cut, and the disease gets worse for people who aren't able to afford, especially people without insurance or with bad insurance. Their diabetes will get worse, and this leads to a lot of health problems. And in many cases, people may require amputation. And between 2009 and 2015, amputations for people with diabetes increased by 50% in the United States. And many of these people disproportionately are poor people and people of color, especially in the South. Another issue where we see how the for-profit system impacts the issue of diabetes is in the issue of the price of insulin. And I think people may have heard about this. Insulin costs about $10 to make a vial, but it's being sold. The drug companies have jacked the price up to $300 to $400. And there's been a 1,100% increase since the 1990s in the price of insulin. Which, so in the 1990s, when the ADA was passed, to now, it's been this massive increase in the price. And that has a direct impact on people's lives. And people have, in fact, specifically died because of this, because they rationed their insulin. They skipped insulin when they should have taken it, and it caused their demise. So we see that as long as this capitalist system is in place, as long as we have healthcare for profit and housing for profit, and jobs, being something that are at the whim of the employer, at the whim of the bosses, we're going to continue to see people not being able to experience the promise of laws that proclaim equal rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Actually, I mean, it's important that you highlight the struggle of people with disabilities, especially just because it shows, I mean, again, how a healthcare system that's for profit has, again, no interest in actually supporting us and our health, ironically. But I also think it's a great segue into talking about the different ways that socialist countries actually support people with disabilities. And so, Joyce, you have a whole chapter on disability in Cuba, and you call it a glimpse of the future. But Cuba is a very poor country and very different from the US. So why is what Cuba is doing relevant here?
Well, precisely because of the comparison. You have the clicker? Yeah. Do we have to this? Okay. The U.S. with a capitalist government it's the richest country in the world. Cuba with a socialist government had been kept poor because it's been blockaded by the U.S. for 6 decades. So what are the differences and what are the similarities? Take healthcare. And the U.S., which Jane very well described, faced with a for-profit medical establishment, the main concern of people with disabilities is adequate health care. In Cuba, one of the highest priorities and the largest budget item is providing quality health care and accessible health care free. It has the highest doctor per patient ratio in the world. Doctors and nurses live in the community and are available 24/7. Its life expectancy is higher than the US, and infant mortality is lower. I'm going to go back to the diabetes situation here. This is a demonstration of 2019 in front of Health and Human Resources of people with amputations, I'm sure a lot of them were diabetics, demanding prosthesis. And they're not getting them from Medicare. It says, look, because they're being told they're not medically necessary. Can you imagine? Maybe someone, the kind of amputation they had changed. Maybe they lost weight. Maybe for some reason the prosthesis isn't fitting right. Maybe it's not advanced enough. There's tremendous advances in these. And they're not getting them. This is the way it is in the U.S. Um, and Jane mentioned that the amputation rate is up 50%, with amputations in the Black community triple the rate in other communities. Now, the U.S. embargo has compelled Cuba to make its own medications for its population because it can't buy them abroad. Because it has a planned economy and prioritizes meeting human needs, it was able to develop Herberprop, which is the medication over there. It's the only drug in the world that enhances the healing of diabetic foot ulcers. It has prevented lower limb amputations from diabetics in 80% of the cases. But the jewel in the crown, so to speak, in Cuba is looking at diversity, equality, and inclusion. Now, we know where Trump stands on that all too well. In 2022, the Cuba passed the most progressive family code in the world. The Families Code, it was called, because it deals with all the different aspects of family life and the different kind of families that can be put together. Modernizes, recognizes, and legalizes all manifestations of families in Cuba. The law defends equality, non-discrimination, dignity, and respect for all forms of diversity. It is a detailed articulation of the rights of people with disabilities also. The Association of Persons with Disabilities are present at all levels of the government in Cuba and took part in the design and monitoring of all parts of the code that concern them. The code explicitly affirms the rights of people living, quote, in a situation of disability, quote, unquote, to a family life with dignity, to an autonomous and independent life, to choose a place of residence, and to a family life free of violence. This includes the right to form a family, to marry, to maternity and paternity, as well as the right to do so. It affirms the rights of people with disabilities to decide freely and responsibility the number of offsprings, the way of having offsprings, the time that should elapse between one birth and another. The code also affirms their right to access information on sexual education and family planning appropriate with their age. So all this is detailed and protected in Cuba. Well, it's all being taken away here. While for decades the U.S. has stalled on creating and implementing the ADA and 504 guidelines, the Cuban Family Code will explicitly guide both the Civil Code in refining and detailing application of the Family's Code in relationship to disabilities and practice of family law. And further protections will involve eliminating situations of vulnerability for people with disabilities and making sure that those who support people with disabilities don't overstep their actions. Isn't this amazing? How detailed? How many areas it covers? While the U.S. is limiting voting and passing laws over the heads of the population, Cuba encourages mass participation and mass feedback. Here's voting for the new families law with the children standing as honor guards around the ballot boxes. 6 million Cubans attended thousands of workplaces, neighborhoods, mass organizations, and meetings to discuss the family code draft. Grassroots suggestions changed half the code. The final version was overwhelmingly passed in a national vote by 68%. These are slogans of the Families Code campaign. Diversity is, humanity is diversity. And laws for all the laws for all the people. While the U.S. is limiting rights to fewer and fewer people, claiming there is only one way for humanity to be, Cuba sees humanity for what it is, diversity, and seeks to secure and protect the rights for all of its peoples in all their complexity.
Give it up for Cuba. As we kind of wrap up the conversation, I encourage you all, we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. But to kind of close this out, Joyce, could you talk to us about, what's next? What would a system centered around disability justice in the US look like? Just to paint a picture.
If you don't dream, things don't happen. We need to take a look at what a socialist US would look like and what it would do with people with disabilities and what it could do. The US has the world's largest gross national product, and it's second in the world's resources. A socialist US would take back the trillions stolen in profits by the banks, monopolies, and characters like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. It would dismantle the military-industrial complex, which would bring another 10 million back into the economy. A socialist US would begin with abundance, where we see Cuba is so poor because of the US and what they did. We would begin with abundance. So it would have the means to immediately ensure quickly that everyone has health care and medical care free, and is free of hunger, has quality and safe shelter, and a job at a decent pay. This would go a long way to meet the needs of people with disabilities, but more would be needed. A socialist government could make sure that disability rights are fully addressed by creating a Disability Rights and Access Administration. Let's see. They're a little out of order. Okay. This is a slogan of the disability justice movement. Nothing about us without us. This administration could really bring that into fruition. No one would be speaking for people with disabilities. No one would be arranging their lives for them. Run by people with disabilities, a Disability Rights and Access Administration could bring the programs for people living with disabilities to control their own lives, have self-realization and autonomy, be regarded with respect, and be valued and integrated into society. This government could have the staff, resources, and legal clout to do this. This DRAA would make sure that people with disabilities are present and visible at all levels of government and employment. With people and disabilities fully in charge, it would develop plans and protocols to implement all aspects of the Americans with Disability Act in employment, public accommodations, public service, transportations, housing, telecommunication, and community support. Centers for independent living, which connect people with disabilities to information and resources, could be expanded into every neighborhood. Working class and poor neighborhoods and homeless populations, which have the greatest percentage of people with disabilities, would get services, jobs, and housing first. This DRAA would decriminalize disability and stop the school to prison pipeline and liberate the hundreds of thousands of people with mostly mental disabilities that are in prisons and jails into an appropriate housing and treatment. Rikers Island now has 54% of the prisoners who have diagnosed mental illnesses. This is such a comment, and this is in New York. It's the world capital of capitalism. It's the richest city in the world, and this is the way it treats poor people, working class people with disabilities. Let me find the slide. Sorry. Oh, that was it. Yeah. We're back to this wheelchair demonstration slide. And this is one of the latest protheses, 3D printed leg prothesis, which means that it will conform to every aspect of your own personal limb. You know, it's amazing. But it's really not available under Medicare. Things like this, all the advancement that we could make with the money at our disposal in a land of abundance, this would just be part of it, you know? And I included this. This is, I love this, the top with the person in the wheelchair sailing. This is from an independent living center now, I think in the Midwest, to show, you know, to show what's wanted and the potential. And that's the way it should be, that people with disabilities can do anything and everything, particularly with the technology that's available now through AI. This is just some stuff I saw online. There's a wheelchair that goes downstairs. Of course, it's not available to people now because you have to pay a lot of money for it. If you're rich, you can get it, you know. And this is a wheelchair that it is a little car. A ramp comes down, the chair goes in there, locks in behind the steering wheel, and that's your car. So this is the kind of stuff that exists now, and you think, what more could happen? Clinics and community mental health services could be quickly moved to rural and urban neighborhoods. And you know, they're really being taken out of rural neighborhoods, and the hospitals are being taken out because they're not areas where you can get the maximum profit in healthcare. Each would be fitted with an exam table that can be dialed to different heights and scales, and that could accommodate wheelchairs. Rent would not be more than 10%. Parasitic real estate developers and landlords that hoard properties, including luxury apartments, would be seized and open to people whose housing is the most unsafe, and people with disabilities whose functional needs aren't met where they live. Low pay for people with disabilities or anyone else would be abolished. You know, there's a special rate. You can pay people with disabilities 11 cents an hour in special factories right now. You apply for this special dispensation to do that. All workers, including people with disabilities and their caregivers, would be guaranteed enough money to meet their needs and to flourish. With only 9% to 19% of people with disabilities working, they would be prioritized for jobs and training. There would be a vast expanse of public transportation of all kinds, with no exploiter defining anyone as less than to justify exploitation. Under socialism, the material base for ableism, sexism, racism, chauvinism, or any form of belittlement and oppression would disappear. But education would still be needed to counter the racism, sexism, homophobia, and stigma of disability inherited from capitalism. Educating all people about disability justice would build empathy and motivate people to understand that everyone would gain from removing barriers so we can all take part in society equally. The DRAA would identify ways to create a positive culture around disabilities. People with disabilities would be made more visible in all areas of life, including entertainment, with the goal of making disabled representation commonplace. The DRAA would control the narrative on how this is done to ensure it avoids ableist assumptions. Disability justice is intersectional. If implemented, enrich all of us. And we are in every communities. The demands of removing barriers, So each human being has the right and opportunity to fully develop their potential. So each person can be defined by their gifts. So each person can be cherished for their contributions to the community. That's what is wanted, and that's what we all want. Socialism opens a door for this to happen. So let's fight for it together.
Thank you to all of our authors. Oh, yeah.
I just want to add a special shout out to our ASL interpreters. Yeah, you know, Trump's buddies in the media, they had a big fuss about the fires in California, and it was not about the fires. It was the fact that they were sign interpreters interpreting for deaf people so they could be safe, and they thought this was terrible. They thought it was terrible, and it was funny. So I mean, we have to remember what they're at right now. You know, sign language is one of the most beautiful languages because it involves the whole body. It involves a tremendous amount of expression. It's really something that we could all learn and we benefit from.
Thank you for that choice. And we also offer ASL classes occasionally at TPF, so keep your eyes peeled for those. We've got amazing instructors. But yeah, I think we have time for maybe like 2 questions. I know we just had a really thorough presentation, so maybe you have all your questions answered, but I know that can't be the case. So my comrade Justice will be running the mic, and maybe we can take both questions at once, and then our authors can take a stab at it, and then we'll close this out for the evening.
Hi. A young woman I know is a student at Galudet, and she had been brutally raped, and apparently this is the commonality of that among disabled people is extreme. And I'm wondering, Joyce, if you have any statistics about that, about the rape or similar brutalization of people who are disabled.
I do remember.
They can't hear you without the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. That people with disability are more at risk for violence, and particularly children. Children with disabilities are tremendously at risk for violence. Yeah, I mean, something that's normalized is that the number of homeless in this city who have mental disabilities, which is another crime, that they aren't treated, that there's no treatment, that people homeless wind up in the streets of the richest city in the world. But there's a whole campaign to create a consensus that they're dangerous, that you can't go in the subway because homeless people live there and they'll push you in the tracks. Well, homeless people are much more inclined to be attacked than to be the attacker. And this is just another way to send them back to jail, or bring more cops in the subways, or just make you more afraid to walk on the streets. I'm not that these incidents don't happen from time to time, but the solution is housing and treatment. It's not more cops.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I guess to your point that you ended on, I'm curious to hear more about your guys' approach to mental health and to madness, especially because, you know, we're out in 2020, you know, saying less cops, more mental health workers, right? But at the same time, we're seeing the state deputize, right, mental health workers to put more people on psychiatric holds, to expand conservatorship. And, you know, I think we can see this repressive apparatus being used by the state. And I'm curious how y'all would articulate how a socialist state might, you know, think about mental health and madness.
Well, I think the first thing, what I see in this city is housing. We all need housing. This is, right in today's paper, this is the second most expensive city in the world to live, you know? And the jails are the institution in this country that houses the most people with mental health disabilities. So we need to decriminalize it. We need to get housing and we need to get treatment. You know, as far back as the Kennedy administration, it was clear that people with mental health issues were being warehoused in institutions. And there was a call for them to be released and treated. There was no right to treatment, to be treated in the communities. And money was given, some block grant money to the states to set up these centers. It was never done. There was a mass release of people from the institutions under the Reagan administration in the 80s, and that's when we see this mass homelessness in the streets of our major cities. There was never a move to put clinics in the cities. There was never a move for treatment. I mean, all these needs to be addressed. It's very fundamental. It has to be looked at. And also the cause of mental illness. This is coming out more and more, that, you know, if you live in a life of stress, if you can't keep a job because there aren't one, if you can't get housing, you know, if you're worried about, you know, taking your insulin every other day, it's going to make you very neurotic and very depressed. So conditions also cause mental health conditions that need treatment, and these need to be addressed as well.
Sunil or Jane, do you want to add anything to either of those questions?
I just think that, just briefly, I mean, there's so many people who are desperately seeking help for their mental health challenges. And there's literally, it's almost impossible to, even if you have insurance, it's almost impossible to find a psychiatrist or a therapist to assist you in this process. And that's a direct result of, you know, the insurance company's stranglehold on healthcare. And it's heartbreaking to see this. And obviously, you know, locking people up in jail and other repressive measures are not the solution. And I think it's something that obviously we can't crystal ball it. But like Joy said, if everybody has a place to live, if we have a comprehensive healthcare system that's free to all, this is going to be you know, a huge first step towards addressing this crisis. And I think it's something that is going to unfold over time.
And I would just second completely what Joyce and Jane were saying, and also note, although I'm not an expert at all in this, I think under our capitalist system, there is a dynamic to create drugs for profit. And there is almost certainly an over-medication of people. The fact that so many young children have ADD, attention deficit disorder, might go to some other aspects of living in our capitalist, consumer-oriented, consumering society. But yeah, definitely the grounds for having security, a safe place to live, not worrying about having enough money for nutritious food, and those sorts of things are a grounding factor that I think automatically in and of themselves would minimize and reduce the amount of mental health issues that are rampant in our society. But also definitely the capitalist urge to create patients who need drugs that may or may not be safe and generate massive amounts of profits.
Thank you. Let's give it up for our amazing authors for sharing all of their expertise with us today. And I think something that we can take away from this talk is that our demands are very simple, you know? Our demands are extremely straightforward because they speak to human needs. We want housing, we want healthcare, we want to be paid living wages, we want education that's affordable, we want, you know, healthcare to actually make us healthy, whatever that looks like. And so we can see also that there's a system that's extremely well organized to deprive us of all of those things. And it's a whole system. And so the only response and the only solution to that is to organize ourselves and to be the answer to that problem. That, you know, it's a plague on society, what they've created, the system that they've created for us. And so we need to transform the world and build a new system that's actually for us. And so again, that was a really big discussion, and that's like, you know, that's all packed. That's not even the whole book. So you should go and grab it from 1804, tell your friends about it, because it's just a crucial facet of our liberation struggle that we all need to deepen our knowledge around and learn more about. And so I hope to see all the new faces here again. I know that I'll see the returning faces again. But other than that, keep your eyes out for all of the offerings that we have at the People's Forum. And again, congratulations to our authors, and shout out to all of the fighters who brought us here this far.